You know, there was a time in America where people took pride in how they looked, how they presented themselves, and how they lived. They lived a traditional life. They had hardworking values, but they were a family. They weren't really divided. There was a sense of unity. Even in times of racial segregation, you had families that lived traditionally. You had this. You've got a picture of a black family here. A lot of people would say that this is wrong because during this time, these people couldn't have been happy because they were in an era that was so full of strife and separation and segregation. But I would argue one thing is, for one, the attitudes of segregation were not universal, not at this time. People say that because it was a government standard, because it was systemic, because racism was systemic, everybody agreed with it. No, not everybody did. In fact, I would argue that there were large portions of society that didn't, and black families lived largely the same as white families. You can find evidence of this, but we live with a retroactive lens where we look specifically at what the segregation was, what the rules were, and what the consequences were. We ignore everything else. We ignore the values that individual people had. Some people saw it for what it was. They called it for what it was, racism. And they fought against it, and that's how we got to where we are today. It was traditional values that carried us out of this, not progressive values per se. Traditional values helped end segregation. Capitalism, things like that ended segregation. People complain about capitalism. People worked hard. Businesses provided for people. They provided good, honest products. Not always. I'm not saying that these corporations were a saint. The 50s was largely the beginning of consumer culture. It was, their advertising was bigger, I think, than it had ever been. You look at the way that things were advertised. 1950s advertising. Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer. Now, a lot of people would say that this is a sexist ad. This is just funny. Women used to be housewives and they used to enjoy it. It wasn't like being a slave. I knew plenty of people who lived this life till they died. My aunt recently passed away. May she rest in peace. I don't know that she was necessarily a stereotypical housewife, but she did a lot of that stuff. And she never really complained. There were hardships, for sure, and times where she probably didn't want to get out of bed and do anything, but she did a lot. But advertisement was huge. For the first time, people were really being... An advertisement isn't new, but there was a major push that you needed this thing in your life. Vacuum cleaners were a big one. There were door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesmen, if you can believe that. There were door-to-door everything salesmen. Salesmen used to come dressed nice with a hat and a suitcase, and sometimes if it was a vacuum cleaner, they'd bring it and they'd say, "Hello, ma'am, my name is so-and-so with the so-and-so vacuum cleaner company. Allow me to extol the virtues," and they would show off the vacuum cleaner. If you would let them in, they would show off how it worked, and they said, "Well, what can I put you down for?" And sometimes she'd have to consult with her husband. Sometimes she'd just say no, but it was largely the beginning of a consumer culture, the likes of which I don't think we'd ever recover from, because it just gets out of control. Advertising today is wildly different than it used to be. It's more gimmicky than ever before because there was a lot of lying in advertisement. So instead of just lying to people, they just get you with catchy music and, like with food that looks good. It was just different. And then you get into the 1960s and it starts to decline. It ultimately starts to go downhill. There's still an idyllic look to everything. There's a style. This is from a TV show. See, it's tough because there's a lot of recreations that look good, but you can tell by the quality of the photos that they're a recreation. Was it really a simpler time? Your 60s photos revealed. But you see, you notice about this family, and this looks like, is this a family friend, or did they adopt, or is this a black family? I think this one is hard to tell. I think this is a lighter skinned black family. But it was a simpler time because people didn't have one of these in their pocket the whole time. Now, I'm going to be honest. I think this is one of the greatest and worst inventions in the history of man. Greatest because we have information and entertainment at our fingertips, so we've always got something to keep our minds stimulated, but bad for those same reasons. Our minds are constantly racing. It's interfering with our sleep. We should be turning these things off and having an hour or two to just decompress before we go to bed, but we don't. We've always got to watch one more show, one more episode of show, one more video on YouTube, see one more post on Facebook. We can't break ourselves away from that. But another thing, too, was the further back in time you go, now we're in the 60s, and we're seeing things are becoming slightly more casualized. Women are still wearing dresses. Men are still wearing button-ups, but they're more comfortable. They're not stiff, big suits and big, heavy dresses. They're lighter. They're more form-fitting and more comfortable, but they're still classy. And people aren't wearing these things because they think they're better than anybody else, or they're trying to show off their wealth. Look at Grandpa over here. He's not too happy because he's old, he's in pain, he's having to wear a suit and stand there. He probably is still working if he's living in New England. He probably hasn't retired. But, people worked hard for stuff. Like, you see people smiling less. People got used to the idea of photos was another thing. Photos, you used to have to kind of make it look a certain way because it was going to be hanging on the wall. You didn't want people to look at it and go, what's wrong with them? But then people over time they said, it's no big deal, as long as we look good enough. But it gave way to a mentality of casuality that has become almost slobbish in today's day and age. I see there are people in Walmart. You look at people in Walmart in their pajamas. Women with unkempt hair all over the place, and people who haven't showered, you can smell them. Just casual and given over. It's pathetic. We really should be embarrassed with ourselves because we didn't learn from past generations who tried to make themselves look presentable. Some people do. I always like to compliment somebody when they look well put together in public in today's day and age. I really do, and I think you should too. If you appreciate how this looked, then take the time to compliment people who go out of their way to put themselves together when they're in public, or even for small things. This is a beautiful thing. Part of the problem is men don't look masculine anymore in a handsome, clean, nicely shaven way. They look slobbish. And women don't look feminine in a nice, beautiful, elegant way. They look slobbish. And not everybody, of course. I don't want everybody to get bent out of shape and say I'm generalizing. But there's a general consensus that if it feels comfortable, then don't put any effort into your appearance. Because that's just superficial. And to be fair, there was a superficial element to that for some people. There was this mentality of, I've got to look better than so-and-so. Or I've got to follow the latest fashion trends. That's where the consumerism aspect I talked about comes in. And that hits roughly, I would say, the 1960s. But in the 50s, it was just getting the ball rolling. And it became, instead of keeping up with the Joneses, it became living for keeping up with the Joneses. Living for materialism. Living for yourself. You start living for yourself, and then eventually you abandon community, you abandon family. And that's where we're at today for a lot of people. They've abandoned their families. They've abandoned the concept of community. They don't even try. We've tried to substitute it with online, but it's not the same. Online community is not the same as authentic in-person community and authentic in-person family. It's nice that we can have video calls with people from all across, and I think people should use that. But it's not the same as getting together in a room and chatting with each other and building relationships with each other. It's not the same. This looks like it was the same family, like they had a big photo shoot. That lamp looks like a carousel in the Warwick Mall in Rhode Island. They've got a carousel in there that looks just like that top. Interesting. But some people will look at all this and say, well, that's all fine and good. People looked nice and smiled and everything, but wasn't it hypocritical? Weren't people just putting on a facade in the 1950s especially? Weren't people just acting a certain way because it was the status quo, not because they actually believed it? And you're absolutely right. For some of those people, it was just idealized. Some of those people did these things because it was the standard. But there were people who were genuinely happy. You know, there were people who, this is from, I think, Leave It to Beaver, which was very idealized. But people were happy, but they did work hard. In some of these pictures, excuse me, I hope I can find it. But in one of these pictures, I like it because it's a more realistic look on people's faces. They're trying their hardest to smile, but you know, life is tiring. I like this one where they're looking at the house. You know, this was when houses had a beautiful, like, look at this beautiful two-tone. You've got the upper siding, and then you've got the bottom, which is just like a slab of concrete or painted brick. There's an aesthetic to it. There's a two-tone. Houses looked unique. They had identity. And people stayed in them indefinitely. They didn't move around as much. This is a picture I think I'm thinking of. This looks like family photos I've seen from the era from my dad with his father. You've got dad he's clearly tired. I mean, these men worked all the time. And the weekends used to be the weekends for most men. There were men who worked throughout the weekends, but these men worked tirelessly so that their families could have food and time together. It was a selfless sacrifice, and we don't have that level of selflessness in the majority of our culture anymore, which is truly heartbreaking. It's selfish. People would rather work at home, which is nice, but they're still working. So their kids are seeing them, but they're separated from them. Whereas when they came home and were home on the weekends, they got to actually invest time with them. They got to do stuff. Let's go fishing. Let's go on a trip. Let's go to the grocery store. My dad talked about Friday nights were the family grocery shopping night. My dad, my grandmother, my grandfather, and my aunt and uncle who lived next door, they would all get together with their kids and dad, and they would all go to the grocery store. That was grocery nights. That was the night to go out and do stuff. You know? There was more of an orderly way of doing things and a planning way of doing things. But now people are so dang busy, they can't sacrifice it. And that's why I think we're seeing sort of a workers' revolution, is people are wanting to work at home. They don't want to go to an office because office culture has gotten so bad. Which I don't blame them for. Office culture is kind of bad, but people have to be willing to work. What scares me is a lack of willingness to work. All of this idealized stuff that you see, all this better look to society is the product of blood, sweat, and tears. It's the product of hard work and people being conservative with their life, with their money, with their ideology. Yes, some of them were hypocrites, absolutely. Some of them looked a certain way, and then, like I like to say, they went to church on Sunday, but then they went to the bar and got plastered on Monday. There were a lot of people that struggled with that. They struggled with all sorts of, they presented themselves one way, but they had skeletons in their closet. And that's why when the 1960s came with the sexual revolution, with the drugs, with all of the different things that people attribute to being, frankly, the downfall of America, it's because people were just shedding this hypocritical look, and they were embracing sort of the oh geez, my mind is all scattered. I apologize. They were embracing the reality of how they were actually living, as opposed to trying to cover it up with nice clothes and materialism. Not everybody was trying to cover things up, but there were a lot of people that were, and that's why the 60s hit as hard as they did. Everything that was hidden was coming out into the open, like the Bible says it will. And that was the cultural shift. And then for the 60s and 70s, it was just kind of a consume, be a bum, do what you want, a lot similar to today. And then in the 1980s, people were starting to remember the values that their parents were trying to give them in the 1950s. They were starting to remember, oh my goodness, there used to be a foundation that we had, a moral foundation, because they were seeing their kids doing hard drugs and damaging themselves, ruining relationships with all sorts of sexual escapades outside of marriage, and they were getting concerned. And so they tried to turn back to this. Some succeeded and were sincere. Others were just trying to do it because they panicked and they weren't sincere about it. And then you got to the 90s, where there was a period of prosperity, and there was almost I don't want to call it a mini utopia, because there were still lots of problems in the 90s, don't get me wrong, but as far as entertainment was concerned, there was an entire overflow of family entertainment, of things that people could tune into. There was like a revolution, kind of like the 1950s, where the Hays Code kept things from getting out of control. In the 1990s, at that point, there had been so much family entertainment, and family sitcoms were making a big revival, you know, but they were also coming to an end because simultaneously you had the more progressive side of culture, and you had shows like Friends and shows about singles, stuff like Cheers, stuff that didn't really value the family as much. It might have extolled some of the virtues of being a family, but it wasn't focused on that. I think Home Improvement was the last true family sitcom, and it ushered in the end. I was watching a documentary about Home Improvement, and I think it was on Bio, and it was on the YouTube channel. It was narrated by Bill Mummy, and he said at the very end of that, he said Home Improvement, the end of Home Improvement ushered in the Friends era. It ushered in the Seinfeld era. Seinfeld was even before that, but it ushered in the era of sitcom and of culture where there was less focus on family. And it's truly tragic. I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, my parents pushed like crazy, being people who were born in the 1950s and went all through, were teenagers in the 60s and college in the 70s. They had gone through and seen traditional culture. They had seen people fall away from it, but they always held on to it because of their faith in the Lord. And they always put emphasis on going to church, and it was authentic because they believed it. And they wanted us to believe it. Ultimately, we had to make our own decisions, but they wanted to show us why it was good. And a lot of us chose to embrace it. I chose to embrace it at 16. When I was younger, I didn't understand it, but I wanted to be a part of it. When I was 16, I started reading the scriptures myself. I started praying. I started engaging with my Christian faith and wanting to be faithful to the Lord and carry on values that honor Him. But my parents pushed those values, and they told us we have to be a family. We have to do things as a family, and we did. Now, they admit today that they made some mistakes. You know, there was a lot of stuff they put emphasis on they probably wish they didn't. That's just life. But at the core of everything was a value set that was authentic. And that's what we're missing today. The world is rapidly changing, but it's not changing for the better because we're not embracing traditional family or being a family. We don't have to like each other all the time, but we should love each other. You know, I saw a quote the other day, I think my brother posted it on Facebook, where it said, blood makes you related, but love makes you family, or something like that. I'm loosely paraphrasing it. And there's truth to that, absolutely. But the underlying emphasis is that people end up being selfish and treating each other with contempt to the point where family becomes a meaningless term. People end up abusing each other. People end up harming each other. And that's the cynical view of the, frankly, progressively thinking people, is that, well, family is just, it's something you're born into. You're not obligated to love these people, especially if they don't love you. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says to love your neighbor as yourself. And I know not everybody prescribes to scriptural principles. I get that. But it pushes people to be better. The Bible pushes people to be better. To be better. And I don't see that coming from any other part of culture. There was a time where culture tried to do it without scripture, which I think was largely the 1950s, and it failed and gave way to the 60s. Because people were... We live in a time where racial and sexual and gender identity are things because people have nothing of worth to hold on to. People used to have family to hold on to. They used to have friends and a culture that they hold on to. Now people move all the time. They work all the time. They're online all the time. They've lost a lot of their humanity, so they have to find it again, and they're finding it in things that aren't meant to be identities. Your skin tone is not meant to be an identity. I don't know how many times I've got to say this. Me being black means next to nothing to me other than, well, it's my heritage. I'm Cape Verdean. But so what? Somebody being white might be their heritage, but it doesn't mean that they were horrible racist slavers back in the day. That's not what that means at all. It's just who they are. Who they are as people is not based on their ancestry. But we've come up with this convoluted thing that says our identity is built into our skin color, our gender, you know, all of these things. And then we try to change these things. People have been trying to change. People aren't just trying to change their gender and sexuality. They're trying to change their race. They're trying to change their entire genetic makeup in the hopes that it'll change their identity. It won't. You are how you are born. How is that ever a bad thing? We've embraced this lie that it's a bad thing to be as you were born. Because when a lot of people are born, unfortunately now, part of the problem is when people are born, they're not properly raised. Parents have to raise their children, you understand? Parents have to give them something that they can pass on to their future generations and that can sustain them in their lifetime. We're not doing that. We're just letting people do whatever they want, letting kids feel whatever thought comes into their head, whatever feelings they feel. And parents are being like, I don't want to get in their way. They're a young free spirit. That stuff started in the 60s and 70s. And that's a mess. We haven't recovered from that. But I think there is hope. I think future generations are seeing the mistakes that we're making. We need to show them how life was, talk about both the mistakes and the positives. People look at the 1950s and they want to talk about the mistakes. There were mistakes, but they don't talk about the positive. I want to talk about the positive and share that with future generations. I want future generations to watch this video and look at the way that life looked and understand that it came at a great cost. It came at a great personal cost. They didn't deal with a lot of things psychologically. So there was a facade, and there was a time when people weren't dealing with things, but they were doing good things for each other. I often maintain, if in the 1950s people had learned to be open and transparent about their feelings with one another more, and that was more accepted, and there was an effort to try to push that with a lot of the sitcoms you saw on TV. They tried talking with each other. Spouses tried talking with each other and being real with each other because people were struggling with that. People were struggling with being transparent because for men it meant being weak, or it was perceived as being weak. It's not being weak. It's being honest with your wife who you love. And subsequently the wife would do the same with the husband. But she didn't want to do it because she wanted to seem like she was well put together and she was a strong, proud woman. But the reality is life is tough. It always has been. The way that we make life better is not by embracing this idea that we make identity out of things that don't matter. What makes life better is we learn to be better people. We learn to be people that have morals, that have a conscience, that have values, that don't just look at other people as out to constantly hurt us. We show generosity, and maybe people respond to that generosity by spitting in your face. So be it. Doesn't mean that you should stop doing good things or be cynical towards people. I know a lot of people who have been very mistreated by people who were supposed to love them. You know, their parents were supposed to love them, but they resent them. So they'll never show love to their family and subsequently never show love to other people. But that shouldn't stop you. If you want love, be it. Learn it. That doesn't mean accept everything that everybody says or does. That's the misconception. People think that love is accepting every notion that comes into somebody's idea of what love is. No. It means say the right thing, do the right thing. Be courteous and kind in general. You don't have to get into the weeds of the politicals, the do's, the don'ts, the ideologies. But you have to just be generally kind. Hold doors open for people. Start small talk about things like the weather. Tell people you hope they have a genuine good day. You know, if a Christian and an atheist get together in a room, they don't know that the Christian doesn't know that the atheist is an atheist, and the atheist doesn't know that the Christian's a Christian. But they interact because they're just in public together. They want to be civil. What is the best thing they can do? Well, they can wish the best for each other. They can talk about how I hope you have a good day, you know. They can meet in the middle where there's common ground. They won't get along with everything. They don't even have to be friends. They just have to be civil. They have one interaction. But we are heading towards a place where those simple interactions people are scared of because there's so much baggage now that people have been so open with, I believe in this, I believe in that. And they've set dividing lines. We're devolving as a culture, ladies and gentlemen. There's no getting around that. We're getting worse. But there is hope that our mistakes can be corrected if younger generations can learn from our mistakes, call them what they are, and reject them wholesale. I'd like to see an era where men have a nice masculine look again that's well put together. It's not toxic by any means. It's just nice and comfortable. And where women can feel comfortable being feminine. You know? But it feels like that's disappearing. Hopefully in my lifetime, though, we'll see a resurgence. I think in some areas I have. You know, when I was at work, there used to be men and women who came in who looked very nice to the... I worked in a beer and wine shop in a grocery store. And there were men and women that came in that looked very nice, and I would compliment them. I say, you look very nice. You look very well put together. I used to hate getting dressed up for work because you had to wear thick dress pants and a logoed polo that was very thick and heavy, but it always looked nice. You know, it was just not as comfortable. I wish they had innovated a little more in the comfort department, and thankfully we have with modern technology. So hopefully we can look better, but not just look better. Hopefully we can be better. We can treat each other with more respect. We don't have to immediately go to what divides us. We don't have to immediately go, well, I hate you because you voted for this person that I don't like and this person's toxic. Who cares who's the president? Who cares? What really matters is from your government is like a step ladder. It's multiple people. Whose president isn't the end all say all be all of the country? It really isn't, and I wish more people would realize that. It's if you want to get involved in the political sphere, it's a big thing. It involves multiple people and documents and processes. That's what that is. But people have boiled it down to whoever's president, and then they argue about it. Oh, well, Trump's an evil so-and-so. No, Biden's an evil so-and-so. Well, they're both human. They've both got problems with each other. They both got their own issues. But you can like one and hate the other. I don't hate anybody because I don't know them. I don't like our current president Biden, but I don't hate the man because I don't know him. And even if I did know him, I wouldn't hate him. It's not in my nature to hate somebody. I can hate their actions. I can hate their policies, but I cannot hate them. I saw a lot of hatred for Donald Trump when he was president, even though he did a lot of good things. People would ignore the good things that he did and automatically go to hatred. That's the problem with our culture. We take the good things that people do and we ignore them and we focus on the bad things that we think people do or the things that we disagree with. There's too many dividing lines. We need to get back to where we unite and start putting the bad stuff away. I don't know how we're going to do it in a balanced way, but there is always hope. I believe, as a Christian, I believe there's always hope in Christ. So let me know what you think. Are you nostalgic for the past? I know I am. I wasn't quite alive for the 50s. I'm a late 90s, early 2000s kid, born in 92. But there was still a semblance of a nuclear family. My family put emphasis on doing everything together. I've lost a lot of family members over the years, and I'm starting to get really nostalgic for them and for that time that at the time I resented, but now I can appreciate as a grown adult. I can appreciate having been in a family that valued each other. And we need to get back to that. I hope that I think there are some in my generation. A lot of my friends are still trying to keep that alive, and I commend them for it. And I pray that the Lord blesses all their families. A lot of them, they've got beautiful families, wonderful kids, and it's a beautiful thing. But it's going to take a lot of work on our part to be able to make society better as individuals. There doesn't need to be a collective thing. There just needs to be individuals coming together to be reasonable and to be kind with one another. And I think it can happen. So, who knows? Maybe you're more cynical about this thing than I am. Maybe you're more hopeful than I am. But I just want to get the conversation started. So thank you very much for watching. This has been Super Koopa. I will see you guys next time. As always, God bless. I sincerely mean that. Have a good one. Peace.